Alright guys, welcome to 5.2, looking at homeostatic mechanism in animals. Let's jump into it. Okay, so homeostasis is the maintaining the same internal environment within an organism. Okay, now this is often in spite of changing or fluctuating in external environment. Okay, homeostasis is a state of equilibrium. Right, the word gets its name from the word homoios, means the same, and stasis meaning to stand still. Okay, which is really an outcome. Right, homeostasis is when the body is in balance or equilibrium, even though the environment is going to fluctuate and change. And homeostasis is achieved through mechanisms that are going to respond to those changes. And so you can imagine it a little bit like a seesaw. And then whenever you get an imbalance, a series of steps occurs, which we'll explain later, to then correct that particular imbalance. And the idea is not to have everything be perfectly still, but the idea is to be able to regulate it so that we're always within a narrow band, despite the fact that the environment might be far outside of this particular band. Okay? Homeostatic mechanisms are usually managed by either the nervous system or the endocrine system or both, and they use chemical communication in the form of signaling molecules. Okay, so for example, this could be a signaling molecule ligand, which is a hormone, and for the endocrine system, these signaling molecules are hormones which are released by glands. And then for the nervous system, these signaling molecules are called neurotransmitters, okay, which are released from nerve endings. Both are received by receptors in certain cells that are going to then induce a response, okay? And this three-step process here, where the cell receives the signal via the receptors, it transduces it into the cell, and then it induces a response. That's called signal transduction, which we covered in chapter 4. Now, some of the things that our body needs to regulate within a certain limit include temperature, water balance, so the amount of water you have in your blood, salt balance, including things like sodium chloride, which is table salt, glucose levels, usually in the blood, pH levels in the blood as well, and then other things like minerals such as calcium, potassium, and so forth, all need to be regulated and kept within a narrow range in order for you, the individual or the organism, to thrive. Okay? Now, how we understand homeostasis is through the stimulus response model. The stimulus response model is just a model that's going to help us understand how the body corrects changes, okay? And it, as the name suggests, comes from a stimulus and then a response, okay? A stimulus is any sort of change in the environment that's going to be affecting an organism, okay? So this could be sunlight, it could be heat, it could be, you going out for a run or whatever, okay? It happens in 5 steps. The first step is the stimulus step, where you have some sort of change in the environment that's going to affect the organism and cause some sort of imbalance or put it out of homeostasis. Then the second step is the receptor or the sensor stage, where the change is then detected by a sensor in the body that receives the signal. Okay, the signal is then sent along an input information pathway that's sent to a control center or a modulator. Now that modulator is an organ or a series of cells that are then going to make a decision as to what to do. And usually the modulator is either the brain or the endocrine system, but it can also be other organs in the body as well. Okay. Now, if it's going to the brain, it enters towards the brain via what we call the afferent pathway, where the nerves are sent towards the brain. Okay. The control center then decides what to do and then sends a signal and output information to an effector, right? The effector is usually an organ or a cell or a group of cells that are then going to follow the commands of the modulator, and then they're going to induce the 5th stage, which is a response, right? Where the effector is then going to respond, and it's either going to restore the imbalance, or in some cases, it's actually going to reinforce the imbalance. Okay. Now, if the feedback that we get is going to counter and correct the original imbalance and fix the problem, that's going to be called a negative feedback loop. Not negative in the sense that it's bad, but negative in the sense that it counters the original change. And in very few cases where the feedback is going to reinforce the initial change, you're going to get a positive feedback loop, okay? And here is just a table summarizing the two differences there. Okay, so in a negative feedback loop, the response is the opposite to the stimulus. So if a decrease is detected, the response is going to want to increase, whatever it is. So, decrease in temperature leads to an increase in temperature. And then in a negative feedback loop, it's going to support homeostasis by bringing back the balance, and it occurs pretty frequently. Okay, that includes things like regulation of body temperature. If it's going to drop, you don't want it to keep dropping, so you're going to try to bring it back up. Okay, or it could be things like blood pressure or glucose, etc. On the other hand, a positive feedback loop is the same as the stimulus. And so if you get an increase, you're going to get a further increase when the body responds. It breaks down homeostasis and actually causes a further imbalance. And sometimes the body wants that. So it's less common, okay? So a good example is during childbirth, and then other examples could be breastfeeding, etc. Okay, so here we're going to start with the positive feedback because there's very few examples of it, but here's a good example of a positive feedback loop, okay? Childbirth. If you are a pregnant woman, you are pregnant for about 9 months of the year, and then after 9 months, you usually go into labor. Now, when you go into labor, what starts happening is you get the head of the baby is going to push against the cervix. Now, when the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, what that's going to do is it's going to send a nerve impulse down the bottom of the cervix here, which is then sending the signal back up towards the brain. The brain is going to stimulate the pituitary gland, and that's going to release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin travels through the bloodstream and heads down to the uterus, where it's going to then stimulate the uterus to then begin more contractions, right? And the contractions are then going to then push the baby, and the baby's head is going to push even more against the cervical lining, right? And that cervix is then going to send another signal, and you can see round and round and go. And so labor and contractions in women during labor often start, fairly subtle, and then they become bigger and bigger and more frequent until eventually you're going to then start giving birth. Okay. All right, so that was a positive feedback loop. Now, we're going to take a little bit of a look at receptors, because receptors are the primary ways in which the body detects change. And so all of the body sensors happen through receptors. Okay, so these are nerve cells that are going to allow the body to detect changes. If these, receptors are going to detect any sort of change outside of the body, they're called exteroreceptors. And then if they're going to detect stimuli inside the body, they're going to be called interoreceptors. Okay. So for example, when the sun shines down on you and you feel heat, well, turns out, you've got heat sensors that are going to pick up on temperature and heat on the skin, and that's an exteroreceptor, okay? On the other hand, your body gets hungry and you can feel the stimulation of the stomach grumbling. That's because you've got nerves in your stomach that are interoreceptors picking up on that grumbling signal, sends it back to your brain and says, hey, I'm hungry, let's go eat some food, okay? Receptors can also be categorized according to the thing that they are picking up the signal on. And so you have things like photoreceptors for vision, which is in the back of your eyes, allowing you to then pick up light and interpret the light as images. You have chemoreceptors that allow taste, smell, and chemical communication around the body. You also have mechanoreceptors, and mechanoreceptors are used for things like hearing, balance, touch, and pressure. And then you've also got thermoreceptors, which are responsible for temperature and heat detection, usually on the skin, but in other parts of the body as well. Okay. All right, we're going to start with the first one, which is thermoregulation. So in the rest of this chapter really looks at three particular ways in which we regulate. The first one's thermoregulation, the second one is glucose regulation, and the third one is osmoregulation. Okay. Thermoregulation is the regulation of body temperature, okay? And so we're going to see if we can try and understand this concept through the stimulus response model, okay? This is a very confusing diagram, but I'm going to break it into two halves. So if you cut the image in half and look at the top half, you're going to see what happens when you have an imbalance of an increase in body temperature. So the stimulus here is going to be an increase in body temperature. So let's say you went out for a run around the oval and it's a very hot day, and your body starts to heat up from all of that heat, from the sunshine and all the heat from your body from running, okay? So when you have that, blood heats up because of your body's tissue, and then the blood becomes warmer than the hypothalamic set point. What does that mean? Well, it means the hypothalamus is your body's thermostat, right? It picks up on the temperature of the blood, and if it rises above what is a reasonable level, it's going to then activate the heat loss center in the hypothalamus. Now, what that does is the hypothalamus then sends a signal, usually a hormone, to two particular parts of the body. One is going to send it to your skin blood vessels, and they're going to dilate. So all the blood vessels near your skin, that's going to dilate, open up, and it's going to allow blood to be moving closer to the surface of the skin and radiate heat from that particular surface, okay, allowing you to then release heat from the skin. The second thing that's going to happen is your sweat glands are going to be activated, and they're going to perspire, which that releases water and salt, and that's going to then be vaporized in the heat, allowing you to cool down. Both of those mechanisms are going to be able to bring the body temperature back down into a reasonable level, and then once it gets down to a reasonable level, the hypothalamus then goes, yep, we're all clear, shut those mechanisms down, and then you stop sweating and you stop being flushed, okay? And so then you're going to counter the initial change, okay? Now, how do we understand this in terms of the stimulus response model? I want you to first hit pause on the video and see if you can go through those 5 steps of stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, and response, and then determine whether it is a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop. Okay, so pause the video, and then once you are happy with that, you can play the video again, and I'm going to go through the responses. Okay, assuming you have already had a go at it yourself, let's have a look at how we can understand it through the stimulus response model, okay? So the receptor, as we looked at in the previous slide, you have thermoreceptors on the skin that's going to be able to detect that your body temperature is rising. And so the thermoreceptors on the skin are going to pick up on the signal, send the signal to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus says, whoa, we're heating up. And so it's going to activate your 2 effector mechanisms, okay? One being the sweat glands, that is going to allow you to sweat and then cool down. And then the second one being the blood vessels to dilate and allowing you to cool down, creating a response that is going to cause a drop in body temperature. That is called a negative feedback loop. Why? Because in the stimulus, you had a temperature rise. In the response, you had a temperature drop. Therefore, it is countering the initial change, okay? Now, if you want to, you can go ahead and see if you can try and work out what the stimulus would be for a decrease in body temperature. So let's say you get out on a cool or a cold day, what is going to happen there, and then how does your body work its way around this particular loop, okay? But I'll leave you to have a go at that yourself. Okay, now other ways in which we can understand thermoregulation requires us to understand, first of all, how does heat move around in the environment in the first place, okay? And that's called heat transfer. Heat moves around the environment in 4 particular ways. The first way is conduction, where you have a direct contact of 2 surfaces, allowing heat to move from one surface to the other. So a good example of conduction on a hot day is, your shoes will start to heat up on a summer's day on the concrete, and you start to feel it on the bottom of your feet quite easily, okay? The second way is convection. Convection is when heat is transferred through the movement of fluids, okay? And you feel this most frequently in a heater. Why? Because the heater, the coil heats up, and then a fan blows the hot air at you, and that's going to transfer the heat towards you, the individual, via the movement of gases and the air, okay? Fluids can also represent liquids as well. So, warm water at the beach, for example, moving around is also a form of convection. The third one is radiation. Radiation is an indirect transfer of heat through electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation, or EMR, includes things like UV, X-rays, infrared, and things like that, and visible light. And what's happening is this, sources like the sun, for example, doesn't actually touch you, or the heat from the sun doesn't actually touch you, but rather the electromagnetic radiation from the sun hits your skin. Your skin absorbs that radiation and re-releases it as heat, and that's what allows you to heat up. And that's why you notice that on a really hot day, all you have to do is get away from the sunlight and into the shade, and you immediately start to feel a lot of relief because you're out of that solar radiation, okay? The fourth way is actually a heat loss method, and it only kind of travels one way, and that's evaporation, right? Evaporation happens when water droplet goes from a liquid into a gas, and that change in energy level, that's going to draw energy from the surface that the droplet was sitting on, cooling it down just a little bit, okay? So, you get out of the pool on a hot day, and then the wind blows, and you start to feel cold immediately because all of that water droplet on your skin, that's going to evaporate, and so you're getting a bit of a double whammy. You're getting both convection, heat transfer with all of the air pushing heat off your skin, and you're getting evaporation as well, which is why it feels extra cold. So how does the body thermoregulate? Well, it responds to cold and heat in different ways. Responding to cold involves a few different mechanisms. Okay, the first one is what we call vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is the constriction of the blood vessels, and what that's going to do is that's going to push blood away from the skin, and it's going to keep the heat from the blood in your body. A lot of the heat in your body is contained in your blood and in your core, right? So if the blood can stay within your core, that's going to keep you warmer for longer, okay? And how it does that is that there's a bit of a ring of muscles around particular parts of your vessels that's going to shut when it detects that it's getting cold. And so what that does, it prevents blood from going too close to the skin and losing that precious heat, okay? And then, when it's not so cold, it does open up, okay? That's the reason why you turn pale on a cold day, because the blood that's in your skin that gives you that kind of the pink hue or whatever in your skin, that's going to drain away from the surface, making you look more pale. Another method in which we respond to cold, which is pretty useless in humans, is what we call piloerection. That is when your hair follicles stand up, and goosebumps is that particular phenomenon happening on human skin. But we don't have a lot of hair, and so it doesn't do a lot. But for an animal like, let's say, for example, a dog or a cat, the standing of hair actually traps heat, and that's going to it's going to trap air, which then traps heat, and that's going to insulate the animal much better. Shivering is involuntary muscle contractions, right? And by contracting your muscles repetitively and quite involuntarily, what that's going to do is going to raise your metabolism, and your body's going to burn more energy in order to heat up again, okay? On top of that, your body can also increase the metabolism via your cells, and so a hormone called thyrotropin is released by thyrotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, which then causes the thyroid stimulating hormone to release by the thyroid to increase the production by the body. And so your body has a series of ways in which it can increase its own metabolism, okay? Now, for those of you who don't know, your metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that's going inside of the body. And so metabolism is the rate in which our body is able to use energy. So a faster metabolism uses more energy than a slow metabolism, okay? That's why they say, people with fast metabolism can eat more, because, they burn up a lot of that energy quicker, okay? How does your body respond to heat? Well, there are two main ways in which it does that. It's called vasodilation and evaporative cooling through sweating. Vasodilation is the opposite of vasoconstriction, where blood is diverted towards the skin through the capillaries closer to the skin, and that's going to allow more heat loss to occur. And that's the reason why you get flushed red when you go for a run, because your body opens up and vasodilates, and allowing all that blood vessels to get closer to the skin, and releasing all of that hot air, right? All of that heat, sorry. The second way in which we respond to heat is by sweating. Okay, that is pores on the body. So you can see in this little image there, the pores on the body in which tiny droplets of water are going to be pushed out, along with a bit of salt, and what that's going to do is going to promote evaporative cooling of the surface of the skin from evaporation of water, and that's going to cool you down. Okay. Now, of course, you also have behavioral method of thermoregulation. You can go ahead and go and grab a drink on a hot day to cool down your body. You can seek shade on a hot day. You can, throw a bunch of water over your face to cool down, etc., etc. You can put on more clothes to respond to cold, or you can start doing star jumps or whatever. Okay. All right. Next thing we're going to look at is blood glucose. Okay. Blood glucose is really important because glucose is really important. Glucose is really important for cellular respiration, providing energy for the body. And so the balance of glucose in the blood is really important so that energy is readily available for the cells to use, okay? Unused glucose is stored within the liver and the muscles as glycogen, and it takes a bit of time to break that down so that you can use it, okay? And so the body needs to regulate the amount of glucose in the blood so that it's always staying at the right level, okay? There are two conditions in which when homeostasis fails, hyperglycemia, which is when blood glucose levels get too high, and hypoglycemia, when blood glucose levels drop too low. Remember, hyper means up and then hypo means down, okay? When you have hyperglycemia, you often experience a dry mouth, a weakness. You get blurred vision because something goes on with your eyes. You get frequent urination because your body's trying to get rid of the excess glucose. You get headaches, and then you also get an increased thirst to try and consume more water to then bring the level of glucose back down, right? When you have hypoglycemia, you experience sweating. You become more irritable, you have a lack of coordination, you get really tired because obviously you're missing quite a bit of glucose in your blood. You get really hungry so that you can bring it back up, and then you get pale, right? Now, how does your body detect blood glucose levels? Well, it does it through a few different ways, but the big player in this blood glucose detection and management is your pancreas. The pancreas is able to detect changes in blood glucose levels and manages it. So it's actually a modulator in its own right? It manages it through two particular hormones, glucagon and insulin. Glucagon is going to stimulate conversion of glycogen back into glucose in the liver and the muscles, and it's going to release glucose into your blood, okay? So glycogen is stored a little bit in the liver, and then it's also stored in the muscles. And so when the pancreas releases glucagon, it's going to stimulate the liver and the muscles to break that back down into glucose, release it into the bloodstream, and bring the blood glucose levels back up so that it becomes readily available, okay? Insulin does the opposite thing. Insulin is going to encourage all of your body's cells to take up glucose from the blood. So it's going to take more glucose from the blood and then thereby decreasing blood glucose levels, okay? So here's a diagram of insulin, and when insulin hits the receptor molecules on your cells, in your body cells, right, that's going to then stimulate the transmembrane protein to actively transport glucose from your blood, which is here, into your particular cell where it gets used. Okay, so that's the role of insulin, right? And both insulin and glucagon is produced by different cells in the pancreas. Glucagon is produced by alpha cells, which are these ones here, and then insulin is produced by beta cells in the pancreas, which are these ones here. Yeah, and so they both play a really important role. And your pancreas is located just around about where your stomach meets your duodenum and runs across in that particular manner. Okay, let's have a look at blood glucose regulation through the stimulus response model. When you have an imbalance, right, you can either have too much or too little. And so let's take a look at an example of a rise in blood glucose level, where blood glucose level increase is the stimulus. So there's your imbalance. There's too much glucose in the blood. Well, the pancreas is able to detect that. So the pancreas is actually going to detect blood glucose levels via the cells in that particular lining, and then it is also the modulator. So the pancreas then detects the change and releases insulin into the blood. Insulin is going to travel to the blood, and it's going to do two things, okay? Number one, it's going to go to the body's cells, and it's going to tell the cells to take up more glucose from the blood, okay? Now that's a good thing because, once you get glucose levels going up, so let's say you had a meal and it's been a couple of hours, and then your body breaks down the meal and releases all of that, sugary goodness into your blood. Well, then your pancreas is going to tell the body to take up some of that sugar, and then you get this burst of energy, right? The second thing it's going to do is if there's excess glucose, it's going to also stimulate the liver to begin converting the glucose into glycogen where it can be stored, right? So then it stays in there, and what it's going to do is it's going to take up some of that glucose from the blood, store it for use later on, and both of these factors are going to bring blood glucose level back down to a normal range. Okay, now that change, that's a negative feedback loop again, right? Because the initial change is that the blood glucose level has gone up, whereas the response is that the blood glucose level has gone down. So it's a negative feedback loop. If you would like to, you can pause the video here and give a go at doing a stimulus response model for a drop in blood glucose level using the diagram there, okay? All right, now the last particular process is osmoregulation. Osmoregulation is the regulation of water and solute balance in the body, okay? So water and ion is a bit of a delicate kind of interplay in the body because water often moves where there is ions. So osmoregulation is the regulation of both water and those solutes in the body, okay? The net movement of water is caused by osmosis. We looked at that in chapter 2. Remember that osmosis is passive and it doesn't take any energy, right? However, it's very slow for the body to only take up water via osmosis. And so what the body can do is the body can actively transport ions, right? And so if we transport the ions, the water is going to then follow and we can speed up that process of collecting water and balancing water in the body, okay? Now, osmoregulation primarily happens in the blood because the blood transfers a lot of the water and the nutrients around the body. And so if we can regulate the amount in the blood, the rest of the body is going to follow it as suit, okay? And now, remember in chapter 2, we talked about the conditions in which the cell can survive really well. Well, here is the 3 conditions in which osmosis has direct results on the cell, okay? You can have a hypertonic environment where there is too much ions outside of the cell and then water is going to leave it and make it shrivel. You can have an isotonic where there is a balance of solutes inside and outside, and so water going in is matching water going out and the cell is staying in a state of balance and equilibrium. Or you can have a hypotonic environment where the cell contains too much ions and the water surrounding it has too little, and then that's going to then cause water to enter into the cell, okay? Now, how you can imagine this is you can imagine this being, the environment being the blood, and so the cells being the red blood cells, right? Here's a microscope, electron microscope sample of blood vessels that are in a hypertonic, and they're actually turning quite flaccid, and then they're going to lyse and break and shrivel because of it. And you can see the shriveling action happening already in these particular blood cells. They look like tiny little sea urchins, right? Now, the body doesn't want this. So by regulating the blood, it also then allows all of the body's cells to then be regulated in its level of water and salt balance, okay? In general, most organisms can be classed as either osmoregulators or osmoconformers, okay? Osmoregulators are organisms that are able to regulate and change the cell's solute concentration. By changing the cell's solute concentration, we can push water in and out of the cell via osmosis, and that's going to balance those particular processes really well, okay? Then you can also have osmoconformers. Osmoconformers can't regulate, and so they're just going to accept their fate of whether or not their cells have too much salt in them or whatever, right? And so that includes things like jellyfish and crabs and most single-celled organisms, okay? They just have a better tolerance range for those conditions by regulating what's happening inside of the cell rather than what's happening between the cells, okay? And so you get, I guess you get 2 different types depending on the environment you find yourself in, okay? Now, let's look at osmoregulators, and let's take a moment to take a look at fish, right? So you can imagine freshwater fish and marine fish have 2 different types of problems, right? In freshwater fish, right, one of the big problems you're going to have is because it's fresh water, there's actually not a lot of ions around. And so naturally, water is going to want to leave the fish and it's going to try and shrivel. So osmoregulating fish in freshwater are going to want to keep water within the body. And so the net movement of ions is going to kind of want to be actively taken in through the gills, right? And then the body kind of pushes it in and out, allowing water to regulate, right? But the gills, they're going to want to take ions actively through the gills. And so the gills are going to actively transport things like sodium, potassium, and stuff like that from the water and takes it into the cells, because that's what's allowing water to then be pulled into the cells and regulate the cells, okay? And the fish also then extracts more of those ions and keeps it in the from its food, all right? And it's gonna want to pass most of the water out. You don't want to put water back into the cells because then that's bad for osmosis. Marine fish, on the other hand, they're going to be the opposite, actually. So they're going to have the problem of basically there's too much salt around them, and so water is going to try and leave their body. And so what they want to do is they want to try and make sure that they keep as much of that water inside the body as possible, all right? And so they're going to be actively transporting the ions through the gills, but this time they're going to try and push, they're going to drink a lot of that seawater. They're going to try and push a lot of that salt back out, right? And what that's going to do is that's going to concentrate the urine, and then that regulation is going to keep water inside of the fish, okay? So there you go, two types of osmoregulators. There are some fish that can actually do both. They can actually switch the process between uptake in and outtake from the gills, and those fish are able to live in both fresh water and salt water as well. All right, let's take a look at osmoregulation in humans, because that's what we are. So there are three major salts that the body needs to regulate, okay? And by doing that, you're going to manipulate water along the way as well. Sodium, potassium, and calcium, okay? These are gained through the diet, and they're lost through sweat, urine, and feces, okay? You have these things called osmoreceptors that are in your hypothalamus, and the osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus, they're going to detect the amount of ions that are sitting in your blood. Now, additionally, you also have baroreceptors, which detect blood pressure in your heart. Your heart, as it pumps, is also able to detect how strong the blood pressure is, how much blood is pushing against those walls. And so by detecting blood pressure, the body can figure out how much blood volume there is, okay? Now, this is really important, right? Because you not only want to figure out, how much solute and ions are in there, you want to also figure out how much blood volume there is. Why? Because when you have an increase in blood pressure, you're going to get a drop in volume or less water, okay? Blood volume doesn't just magically disappear. It only increases in pressure because you have a drop in volume, okay? So, here is a diagram showing that. This is a physics diagram, but you can just kind of appreciate the mechanism, okay? So imagine this is your blood, right? If the volume drops, you're going to get an increase in pressure, right? Because you now have a higher concentration within a smaller space. And so when you have a drop in volume, if nothing inside changes, you're going to get an increase in pressure, right? And so the body, particularly the heart, when the heart picks up an increase in pressure, that is equated to a drop in volume, which tells the body that it's losing water, right? Really important, because if you get this increase in pressure, the body's going to interpret that as, oh no, we're losing water. That's why the blood's getting stronger in its pressure, okay? On the other hand, if you get a decrease in pressure, right, that means that there is a rise in volume. So you can imagine this going the opposite direction, right? That means you've taken more water into the body, right? So for example, you go out into the kitchen, you grab a drink of water, and you drink like 3 or 4 cups of water in one go. All of that water is going to get absorbed into your cells and into your blood. And when it gets absorbed into your blood, what that's going to do is it's going to increase the volume of blood you have. And then the body goes, oh, hold on. The baroreceptors in the heart goes, oh, hold on. We've got more blood than usual. I think, our man's or our woman's drank more water, and then it's going to try and kick in that osmoregulation, okay? So this one's a little bit more straightforward. The osmoreceptors can tell how much sodium, potassium, and calcium and other minerals are inside of your blood directly, but whereas this one here figures out blood volume by figuring out blood pressure, okay? Now, you take these two things combined, both blood volume and solute concentration, that gives you a measurement called osmolality, right? Osmolality is the measure of blood solute concentration overall, considering both the solute concentration and the blood volume, okay? If the body isn't able to manage the blood solute concentration, that's going to have effects on the intracellular fluid or the cytosol of cells. Why? Because those cells are in contact with the blood. So if the blood solute and water concentrations are off, the cell's water and solute concentrations will then be off, and that's going to have bad effects on the cell itself. Okay. So here's an example of that, right? So you can see there, potassium, sodium, potassium are all transported in and out of the cell, and particularly, potassium and sodium are important for our nerve cells at our dendrites and our axons, because they're actually what's responsible for sending nerve signals around the body, okay? And that's through the sodium-potassium ion pump, right? And we looked at that back in chapter 2. Okay, so how do we understand osmoregulation? Well, our osmoregulation can be understood through two molecules, ADH and aldosterone. Okay, I'm going to go through ADH first. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is regulating water reabsorption by the kidneys. It's also known as vasopressin. ADH is a peptide hormone, right? It's produced by the hypothalamus and it is stored in the pituitary gland, right? ADH increases permeability to water of the distal tubules of the nephrons, okay? Your nephrons are located in your kidneys, okay? So osmoregulation is really done by the kidneys, and particularly the filtration unit in the kidneys called the nephron, right? Here is a single nephron unit, and you've got 1 million of them in each of your kidneys, and they're connected to your blood vessels, right? Now, if you're unsure on how the kidneys work, you need to go back and look at the excretory system. But in one of the areas, the distal tubule and the collecting tube, the ADH works in this particular tube to reabsorb more water from the urine that moves through your nephrons. Okay. And that's the reason why when you reabsorb water back into the blood, you're going to concentrate your urine, right? And so basically, the darker the color, the more concentrated the urine is, and the harder your kidneys are working to reabsorb water from your blood back into your blood, right? And so, the more water you drink, the less, the clearer your urine should be, whereas the less water you drink or the longer you go without drinking, the more concentrated it will be, right? And when you get past somewhere around here, you're pretty much dehydrated. Here is the chemical structure for ADH for all of the chemical nerds there. All right, so let's look at the stimulus response for ADH and how the body osmoregulates, right? So let's say the stimulus is an increase in osmolality from sweat. That means that you're basically getting more salt loss from your body, and you need to then restore a lot of that water back in, right? So you've just gone for a run and you're really sweaty, you've lost a lot of water, right? And that means that your osmolality has gone up. Why? Because the concentration of solute has gone up because you've lost so much water, right? How is it picked up? Well, in the receptor stage, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus and the baroreceptors in the heart are going to pick up on that signal, okay? Then the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is going to release ADH. ADH then travels down towards the kidney tubules, and then it's going to cause those kidney tubules to open. And so the kidney tubules, they're the effector, right? So you can say that both the kidneys and the nephrons, or specifically the distal tubules in the nephrons, are the effector mechanisms. And then the response is that by opening up those tubules, water is going to be reabsorbed back into the blood, concentrating the urine, okay? So once again, that is a negative feedback loop because you're bringing water back into the blood, and so therefore it's going to restore the water that was lost in the first place from your very excruciating run. Okay. Now you can pause here and go through osmoregulation or a stimulus response model for a decrease in osmolality. So for example, let's say you drink a cup of salt instead of drinking a cup of water, right? So what happens then, right? All right, assuming you've given that a go, I'm going to move on to the next one, right? Which is aldosterone, right? Aldosterone is a little bit different, okay? Osmoregulation through aldosterone doesn't reabsorb water. What it does is it actually reabsorbs salt. Particularly, it's going to increase the amount of sodium and potassium reabsorption by the kidneys, okay? let me rephrase that. It's going to increase the amount of sodium reabsorption, and it's going to dump and release potassium excretion. Now, aldosterone is a corticosteroid hormone, so it's not a peptide hormone, slightly different. It's produced by the adrenal glands, which are sitting just on top of your kidneys. Okay, so here's your kidney, the little bean-shaped thing, and then the adrenal gland is on top. Okay, and what actually happens is when you have a drop in blood volume, right? In other words, too much water has left the blood. That actually creates a stimulus, which releases an enzyme called renin, right? Renin, whatever you want to call it. Renin then works on the adrenal gland itself, right? And what the renin does is it's going to release aldosterone, right? So the adrenal glands then release aldosterone, and the aldosterone then works on the kidney itself, right? Aldosterone increases the amount of salt your body is going to reabsorb into the blood. Now, what that's going to do is that's in turn going to draw more water with it, right? And by drawing more water with it, it's going to increase the overall blood volume, right? And so what it's doing is going to push the water back into the blood, increasing the blood osmolality, right? So here's a diagram of how that works. Now, very sophisticated because you've got a whole bunch of different chemicals here, including actually ADH up here. But I want you to pay attention to the aldosterone here, right? So ADH in the previous slide works at the collecting tubules here and here, right? To concentrate and reabsorb water. Aldosterone actually works to reabsorb sodium in these particular grounds, and it's going to push the sodium into the interstitial fluid, which is here. By pushing the sodium into the interstitial fluid, what that's going to do is it's going to draw water out of the loop of Henle along here and out of the distal tubules and the collecting duct again, allowing water to be reabsorbed, and all of this then collects it back into the blood vessels, which then increases the blood volume overall. Okay, now that's a lot to take in, so hopefully you guys managed to pick up on all of that. If not, feel free to obviously go back over the video and go through any parts that you've missed out. But otherwise, I will see you guys in the next one. Okay, see you guys.